Hello and welcome to another video. So this is the first part of a new series in which we will be building a blogging API. So this blogging API will be same as the one we built with Axum. The only difference is we will be using Actix Web in this one. So today we will build a basic HTTP server, but we will have proper folder structure and environment as well. So this is the folder where I want to create my project. So I'll just initialize this folder with cargo. Now let's open up in VS Code. Okay, we will go to cargo.toml. Here we will have to add a bunch of libraries. So first up we have Actix Web. Now let's scroll down a bit. Here you can see the basic code for a server. We can copy this and paste it in our main.rs. With this we do have a basic server with one endpoint named hello. But let's add a few more packages. So it's Surday, JSON. These two are for serialize and deserializing and just to handle JSON. Then we'll add envlogger.env. Okay, now let's go back to our main.rs. Now let's set up our logger. So in Actix Web, we have a logger which logs all the information of the incoming request. So let's set up that. So first up, let's check our environment variables. If Rust log is none, then we will set that Rust log variable. Next, we will initialize .env. And finally, we'll do env logger init. Okay, now all we have to do is add a middleware, which we can do with .wrap, and then give the default logger. Let's import this logger, and we will import this from Actix Web. Great, with this our logger is ready. So let's run our server and see if it's working or not. Okay, if now I open up my Postman and send the request to the endpoint, we have our response. Now let's go back to our VS Code, and here you can see we are getting a log for that request. Okay, next let's create some folder structure. We will add few folders. First routes, then let's add handler inside routes. Next we'll create a folder called utils. Inside utils, let's add a file called constants. So this will hold our constants like address, port number, etc. And let's have a mod.rs for this folder. Okay, so we have defined the constants in our mod.rs, but we also need to define our utils folder as a module inside our main. So we'll do mod utils, and that should allow our utils to be used in our main or any other crate for that matter. Okay, next we'll do the same thing for handler. We'll create mod.rs for handler and routes. And let's add them in our main.rs. Okay, next up, let's add our home routes. And in handlers, we'll add our home handler. Okay, so you can see that I have divided a lot of our code already. So we have home route and home handler. Currently, we do have all our routes inside our main. but we'll divide all this code in bunch of files like home handler, home routes. But first, let's go to our main and set up our constants. So here, if we see, we have our address and port, which we are hard coding. So let's change that, and we'll use this crate called lazy static, and we'll fetch the data from our env. I haven't created env, we will create that, but first let's set up our constants. So we'll do lazy static, and inside lazy static we'll create two constants with pub static reference. So address will be of type string, and we'll set it equal to a function. Let's name it set address. We haven't defined set address yet, but we will. We'll do the same thing once again. This will be for port. Type will be U16. Okay, now we have to define the functions. So we'll do function set address, return type string, initialize our .env, and then just fetch the data from our .env file. Let's do the same thing for port. The only difference is we will parse it to U16 at the end. Okay, great. Now let's use those constants inside our main.rs. So we'll do let port equal to utils. I believe we have utils. Yes, util is also in Actix. So we'll do utils, constants, and then finally the name of the variable. That's port. Let's clone this, and again we'll copy this and do the same for address. Finally, let's change in our bind method. We'll pass here our variables, and this should do it. Okay, so now we have removed our hard-coded address and port number. Next, let's segregate our code. So let's send this greet method into our handler, and let's send the routing for this inside our home routes. So first, let's remove the routing. Now let's just copy, or let's cut this method and paste it into our home handler. Now okay, so I think we have not defined mod.rs for this file. So let's go to mod.rs, and we'll do home handler. And okay, we also need to define our handlers inside our mod.rs for routes. And since we already have our mod.routes inside our main.rs, so this should create like a hierarchy where our handlers module is inside our routes module. Okay, let's go to home routes. Here we'll create a public function. Let's name it config. It will take a parameter called config as well with a mutable type, and we'll have a web service config. So we'll define service here just like we did in our main.rs. So we'll do handler, home handler, and then, okay, so we don't have the method here, maybe because we haven't made that public yet. Okay, we have some errors in home handler. We need to import a few stuff. Good. Now let's make this public so that we can access it in our home routes. Okay, here, now we can access this. Okay, we need to configure this inside our main.rs. So let's go to main, and we'll do dot configure inside our routing, and then we'll do routes, home routes, and then config. Now everything looks good. Let's create another route. We'll name this test. Remove this parameter and also remove this parameter from the function. We have errors, so let's remove this name. We still have an error. Okay, so we have same function name. Okay. Let's rename this function to test. Now, if we need to add this route, we will have to go to our home routes and we'll add another service here. This way we can handle our routing, and our routing is also segregated. We can have as many configure as we want, and we can have as many routing inside those configure as we want. Let's give a prefix to all these routes. So we'll create a new service at the top, and we'll start with web scope, and we'll pass the prefix, that's home, in this path, and then we'll send both the services inside this web scope. Okay, now we have added this prefix slash home to all the routes, and now let's run the server. So okay, so we are getting an error. Okay, so we haven't defined our .env file, so let's create a new file, .env, and define address and put there. Okay, now let's open up our Postman. If I send a request, you can see we are getting slash home slash hello, and next we have slash home slash test as well. So now we have proper folder structure and routing. Let's do one final thing, that is create a proper response structure. So for that, we'll create a new file inside our utils. Let's name this file API response and add this to mod.rs. Okay, so we'll create a public structure called API response. First up, this will have a status code of type U16. Next, let's create our body of type string. And then we'll create one other variable. Let's make this will not be public, and we'll make this status code. Now let's create an implementation for API response. So we'll have a function new, which will take parameters status code and body. So this will initialize our API response. So status code and body will remain the same, and we'll use status code that we get to generate the response code. Okay, now let's go to our handlers and change the return. So here we are returning a string. Let's change this to our new structure. So in new will pass 200 and the body. Currently we are getting an error. This is because we haven't implemented responder. So it does not have the trait. So let's implement the responder for API response. I will implement missing properties, in which we'll get body. So for body we'll do box body, and then we have a function respond to. So let's initialize the body using box body. And to get the actual data for the body, we have our body variable, which is in the structure. So we'll do web bytes mute from. Inside from we'll do self body as bytes. And next, let's set up our HTTP response. So we'll do HTTP response new. Again, we'll use our response code here. So we'll do self.response code, and then we'll do set body. And since we have already created the body, we'll use that. Now this should do it. And if we go to our handler, we can see that the return error is gone. The only problem is the string. So let's add toString here, and that should fix the type error. Let's do the same for the greet method. Now we have proper responses as well. So this API response will also allow us to return some errors if we want to. And also this will help us when we will be trying to add middleware for authentication. We'll just add a trait into it. But for this video, this much should be enough. And now let's test all of this. So we'll do cargo run, and let's open up our Postman. We can see that our home/test out is working. Next, home/OptiCode, and we get that as well. So we have our logger working, we have proper folder structure, and we have our proper response. So that's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please give a thumbs up if you did, and do consider subscribing.